Thank you very much, Chairman Sessions. My mother was an immigrant from Lithuania. She was brought to America at the age of 2 with her brother and sister. My grandmother carried them off a boat in Baltimore and put them on a train to what they consider to be the promised land, East St. Louis, Illinois. My grandmother didn't speak English very well, but she was determined to have a better life for her children and her family. She worked hard, our whole family worked hard, and as her son, I ended up with a full-time job. When you reflect on my background, my family story, it isn't just mine, it's America's story. It's who we are. We are a nation of immigrants. On the issue of refugees, there are 2 members of the United States Senate who are the sons of refugees. One is running for president of the United States. So I want to put this in context when we talk about issues. We're talking about real lives and real people. And today we're talking about the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. This refugee crisis has almost 60 million people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes around the world. Syria is the epicenter. When they ask me what I think of when you say the 2 words Vietnam War, instantly my first impression is a photo image of a little girl, a victim of napalm, naked, running down a road toward the camera, crying with her arms extended. What is my image of Syrian refugees? It's a 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned in the Mediterranean. Ellen Curdy. I looked at that little corpse that washed up on the shore and thought, that's my grandson. That's the image I take from the Syrian refugee crisis. More than half of Syria's 23 million people have been forced from their homes. More than 4 million Syrians are registered as refugees, including almost 2 million children. More than 10,000 Syrian children have been killed. Thousands are unaccompanied and separated from their parents. They're not economic migrants. They are refugees fleeing for their lives. The poet Warsan Shar, who is herself a refugee from Somalia, put it well when she wrote, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." The Syrian refugee crisis has placed a great strain on many countries. The tiny country of Lebanon, population 4.2 million, now hosts 1.2 million registered Syrian refugees. More refugees per capita than any country in the world. That's almost 30% of their population. And Jordan, of course, going through the same type of strain. Do we have any obligation in the United States to face this? I think we do. History tells us we should. We've taken some positive steps to address this crisis. The United States is the most generous donor to the refugees of any nation in the world. We're providing safe haven to hundreds of Syrian visitors in this country who were allowed to stay on a temporary basis when the war developed. After last year's hearing, I held a hearing on Syrian refugee crisis. The administration issued exemptions so they could stay and not return to the danger of Syria. But so far, the United States of America has accepted about 1,600 Syrian refugees. 1,600, a small number. In May, I joined with Senator Klobuchar and 13 other senators, asking the administration to admit at least 65,000 by the end of 2016. Administration is now looking at 10,000. Why does it take so long? Because our vetting process is very careful. It takes from 14 to 24 months after the initial interview for a refugee to be accepted in the United States. This notion, and you'll hear it on the campaign trail, that we just throw our doors open and say, come on board, is not true at all. I've gone through a classified briefing, and the background checks that we impose on these people are very serious and very thorough, and they take a long, long time. Germany's announced they're taking 800,000 Syrian refugees. Their average time for vetting, 4 months. Ours, 18 to 24 months. We're careful. If we are going to show that we have a heart we're also going to be thoughtful about it too, and do everything humanly possible to avoid any dangerous person from ever coming to our country. So what is the lesson of refugees in the United States? There's a lesson from World War II, isn't there? You remember a ship called the St. Louis? Came to our shores with Jews from Europe. They said, if you don't take us, we'll go back to Europe and die. We didn't take them. They returned to the Holocaust. After the war, we accepted many refugees, hundreds of thousands. In Vietnam, we think maybe some 400,000 ended up coming to the United States. Soviet Jews who were allowed to come to this country to avoid persecution, over 200,000. And let me add, when it came to Cuban refugees, the numbers now are about 650,000, including, as I mentioned earlier, the fathers of two of our colleagues in the United States Senate, one of whom is running for president. We resettled more than 150,000 refugees from the former Yugoslavia. And the reason I want to raise that point is because there's something that must be said. We're talking about many Muslims who've come to the United States and become an important part of our country. In my condo building in Chicago, Illinois, there are two Bosnian Muslims who are the hardest working people I know, so proud of their families and proud to be part of this country. And as we'll find here from groups that send us statements, including in particular a letter signed by 400 faith leaders expressing strong opposition to any effort to limit the resettlement of Muslim refugees. Let me just close by saying, on an economic basis, it's true. Some of these refugees come here dirt poor and need a helping hand. I met 4 of those families just 2 weeks ago in Chicago. But the statistics will also tell us that that changes very, very quickly. As soon as they can command enough of the English language, they're off and working hard at some of the toughest jobs. Some of them turned out to be pretty successful. The late General John Shalikashvili, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, former Intel CEO Andrew Grove, the pioneer of the semiconductor industry. Oh, and I didn't mention Steve Jobs, the son of a Syrian immigrant. So I would hope today that as we reflect on this issue, we reflect on history. The last thing I'll say is I'd like to introduce the members of this subcommittee to Hussam Alustrom. Mr. Alustrom, are you here? Please stand. Thank you, sir. He fled his home in Homs, Syria in 2013 after his house was shelled by a missile from the Syrian army. He moved into another house with 5 other families, and that house was shelled and destroyed as well. He moved to another neighborhood, but barrel bombs were being dropped in that neighborhood. He then fled Syria with his wife, Suha, and 2 children. After a long and difficult journey through the desert, Mr. Alustrom ended up in Jordan, where he applied for refugee status. After a long process, he and his family came to the United States on June 16th this year. He now works 2 jobs. He moves furniture during the day, and he's a baker at night in order to support his family. Mr. Alustrom is not a terrorist, and he's not a fiscal drain on America. We should be proud that our country has welcomed Mr. Alustrom and his family. That is what our country's refugee settlement program is all about. I hope my colleagues in Congress will come to understand that as a result of this hearing. Thank you, sir.